The mahogany door swung shut behind me with a polite thud, the kind of sound that marks a threshold into a life arranged by other people's expectations. A foyer of marble, a staircase that looked like it belonged in a historical drama, and a woman already turned toward me with the practiced smile of someone conducting a small, private audit. Patricia Whitmore tilted her head, looked me up and down, and murmured close enough for my ears but soft enough to spare anyone else, "You could be the help." It landed like a stone in the pool of the evening. Everything rippled, the polite laughter, the clink of a glass, the way Marcus's shoulders tightened for a fraction, and then relaxed as if to reassure himself this was just a shadow. I kept my face still. I had rehearsed stillness. I had rehearsed 1,000 little lies that were really only omissions, tiny shudders over the truth of who I was and how I lived. I am Ellagram, and if you met me on the street, you would probably assume I had the sort of life that buys quiet certainty rather than loud statements. The truth is more complicated. I design systems people rely on. Senior software architect is the title on my card, and I make a comfortable living doing work that most people never see. My apartment is modest by suburban standards. 2 rooms, thrifted curtain panels, a chipped mug from a farmer's market that I think of as my good one. My grandmother Margaret calls it practical dignity. She taught me something that had lodged in me like a seed. A person's character is clearest when no claimant to status watches. That was the idea I carried with me the night I walked into the Whitmore house in plain flats and a dress I'd bought on sale. I had decided to test them. That sounds dramatic when I say it now, but at the time it was closer to a quiet experiment. Marcus and I had been dating for a year, enough to know the contours of each other, not enough to know the architecture of his family. He was charming, unshakably kind in the small ways that made me fold into him. He was also, I suspected, fluent in the politics that came with his family name. The Whitmores had their rituals: country club brunches, an expectation that you would marry well, a preference for people whose income was an accessory rather than the main point. Marcus loved me in the ways he knew how, gentle, present, often apologetic for things he hadn't done. But there were holes in how he defended me, a softness that worried me. He would avert his eyes when Patricia made a cutting remark. He would laugh too fast at Vivian's jokes. He would steady his voice when their world felt threatened. I wanted to see who they were when the audience was small. I wanted to see whether Marcus's family would value me for what I was or for what I might become in their ledger. Marcus's lesson wasn't a mandate to entrap people. It was a compass. If the people I loved hid their contempt behind smiles, I deserved to know. So I presented myself as someone easy to dismiss. Modest clothing, minimal makeup, flat shoes. I let conversation about expensive vacations pass without mention of my own, deflected compliments about my intelligence with self-deprecating jokes. It was a performance of invisibility, calibrated to invite the worst and reveal it. The dinner table was a stage set for evaluation. 6 forks on each side of the floral centerpiece, napkins folded like little mountains, a chandelier that made even the simplest face look like a portrait. Patricia presided at the head with a practiced neutrality, an experienced hostess who used welcome as a weapon of control. Vivian, radiant in a way that seemed polished by dollars, seated herself 2 places down from me and arranged her laughter like a necklace worth showing off. Early in the evening, Patricia made an observation loud enough for the room to catch. "Marcus, isn't Ella's family from the old part of the city, the more authentic neighborhoods?" The emphasis was soft, but it had teeth. I could tell Marcus felt the barbs. He tried to steer the conversation to neutral ground, about Marcus's latest property deal, about a charity run he'd forgotten to mention. That was his script: placate, deflect, move on. He wanted to protect me by smoothing things over, but protection and defense are different things. At the table, there were moments meant to embarrass rather than to include. A toast about good matches that slid into an anecdote about Alexandra Castellano, a name like a polished coin in their mouths. Alexandra was the one to measure to. Networks, family businesses, dovetailing into mergers, a pedigree that fit the Whitmore mold. Alexandra existed on the same axis as the family's idea of success. She was the one they compared me to with the casual cruelty of people who believe social sorting is a natural law. Vivian's attention was performative. She watched me as if seeing a specimen under light, the way I used my napkin, the placement of my fork, the lack of brand names in my speech. "You don't seem like Marcus's other women," she said at one point, the trailing comment more accusation than question. I smiled, kept my voice small. It felt like walking through a hall of mirrors where each reflection filed me down to a more convenient shape. Marcus was there, and he was doing that thing he always did, trying to be mediating, trying to be diplomatic. I saw his jaw move in silence. I saw the quiet apology in his eyes that said more than words. He loved me, but he loved peace more, and that would turn out to be a fragile kind of love in the face of manipulations I hadn't yet guessed. I could have openly challenged them that night. I could have stood and said, "I'm not who you think I am, and you don't have a right to treat me as less." But I chose otherwise. Margaret's voice was in my head. Observe when you can, confront when you must. There are different ways to make people accountable.
Shame rarely changes minds. Evidence does. So I let myself be underestimated. I listened. I smiled. I watched the conversation tilt. Midway through the night, I went to the powder room to send a message to a friend. Something casual, a photograph of the simple cake they'd set out. The hallway outside the bathrooms was narrow, lined with family photographs and the soft hum of music from the dining room. As I pressed the button on my phone, the voices around the corner sharpened into a cadence I recognized, the conspiratorial half-whisper that people use when they are counting on you to be absent. At first, I thought it was about some business deal. Then the tone shifted, the words smoothing into plans and names. I paused, one hand on the hallway runner, my phone forgotten. The floorboard sighed under my weight, an incidental sound that might as well have been a metronome to the truth I had just stumbled upon. "I don't want to get into the messy parts," Patricia was saying, "but Marcus is useful. He'll do. He's a placeholder if we need him." Vivian's laugh, too sharp, filled the small corridor. "Placeholder in what sense?" she asked. Patricia: "It's not a cruel word. It's strategy. We have the merger with Castellanos pending. Alexandra brings a lot. But Alexandra has her own alignments. If things don't lock exactly how we want, Marcus could be paired off, positioned as the one who nearly was, to keep narratives tidy. A respectable engagement, a timed scandal, people breathe, decisions are made, and the family stays intact." There it was, like a slow leak finally revealed. The language was clinical, the intent colder. Not just disapproval of me, but a plan that treated relationships like chess pieces, used and discarded for the right move. Marcus's name was mechanized into a tool in their mouth. I felt something in my chest bruise, not a physical hurt so much as a moral one. The family had not merely judged me, they had calculated how to use me. I should have left then. I thought of that, of the dramatic exiting I could have performed. I imagined the scene, stomping down the stairs, revealing myself as not the naive woman they presumed. But Margaret's lesson is not about theatrics. It is about making sure truth has weight. If I stormed out, it would be a personal vindication, a private victory. But it would not dismantle the architecture that allowed this calculus, the networks, the deals, the people who looked the other way when family members profited. So I stayed. I pressed myself flat against the wallpaper, a shadow pressed into patterned fabric, and I became quiet as felt paper. They continued, under the assumption their conversation was private, because it was in a hallway, and because the people around them were drunk on their sense of security. Patricia spoke about timing, about how an engagement could be used to keep a brand stable if it came down to it, public relations as family politics. Vivian mentioned numbers, an offhand reference to accounts that skimmed too high, a line item that made no sense in a legitimate ledger. There it was, a glimpse of something they thought no one was listening to. Talk about. I pressed my palm to my mouth to still the sound that wanted to come out. My heart was loud in my ears. Marcus should have been there. His voice was missing from the plot. Or rather, it was present in a different register, muted compliance, an inclination to let decisions be made above his head rather than formed with him. He hadn't raised his hand to correct them. He didn't say, "You cannot speak of me like that." He had, in the past, tried to diffuse tension with a joke or a smile. Tonight he had not intervened. Hurt rose in me, hot and bright and immediate. It was the kind of hurt that ferrets out every justification you might have had for people who love you. It asks whether they ever really did. But hurt can be a compass if you let it. I felt the tide of my plan change. This was not merely a family that preferred pedigree. It was a family that engineered outcomes, using people inside and outside their circle. That went beyond high-handedness. That swam into danger. When the hallway conversation wound down, they returned to the dining room, laughter stitched back over their words like a makeshift bandage. I walked back in, smiled at the same jokes, answered the same polite questions. My exterior was calm. Inside, my mind was a ledger. I cataloged what I had heard, the language about a placeholder, the casual mention of finances that didn't add up, the way Marcus had not defended me. I had trails, words were among them. I had a motive for entering the fold unthreatening, to collect what could be proven. I ate the rest of my salad as if nothing had shifted. The thing about sitting in the eye of a storm is that you can watch the winds pretend to be gentle while their undercurrents rearrange the house. I left the dinner with a plan that felt like a new gravity. This was no longer only about tests and Margaret's lessons. It had become a matter of pattern and public risk.
If the family was prepared to manufacture moments to smooth over deals, it could extend to other kinds of manufacture, financial manipulations, misallocations, and worse. People with power sometimes think of relationships as tools. People who are used rarely get to choose whether they will be. When Marcus walked me out, his arm brushed mine, awkward and familiar. He murmured something about calling me later, an attempt at tenderness. I said don't. It wasn't a refusal of emotion, it was a request that he not treat me like a subject to be placated later. He looked hurt and confused, which only made me harder to read. He was caught between who he wanted to be and the gravity of his family's gravity. Back at my apartment, I sat on the small couch and listened to the city beyond my window hum like someone else's life.
My phone buzzed with messages, small gestures of concern or casual life updates. I did not answer. That night I set a kettle on and poured loose tea, the action and anchor against the whirl of what I had heard. Margaret's pendant lay on the table beside my mug. I twirled it between my fingers until its metal warmed from friction. She had gotten through a life of small indignities with a steady face and a stubborn insistence on acting well. She would tell me, perhaps over biscuits at 2 in the afternoon, that the world does not reward stunts. It rewards patience and clarity. I did not sleep much. I sat at my kitchen table and cataloged what would be needed if I chose to pursue what had been implied. I rejected the dark fantasy of revenge and replaced it with a ledger of legalities. Evidence, I reminded myself, is not a story you tell at a dinner. It is a set of things you can show someone who must act: a regulator, an industry partner, a lawyer. I would need documents, witness statements, corroboration that something financial was amiss. I would need people with knowledge outside the family, not just blood relatives who could be swayed by lies. I would have to be careful not to become what I abhorred, a person who weaponized humiliation for private satisfaction. There is a particular clarity that comes when you switch from shock to action. I began to build a reasonable path forward. Start with what is public: corporate filings, public records, the kind of paper trail that exists where companies transact with the world. Speak with industry contacts, not to accuse, but to ask questions that might illuminate patterns. There are always people on the edges of any story who want to be told the truth, especially when truth will free them from a bad contract or a manipulative partner. I thought of Richard Hartley, a name Marcus had mentioned in passing months ago, someone involved in a failed venture with the Whitmores. If there were a person who felt wronged, that would be a starting point. I wrestled with another choice: how public to be. I could expose everything dramatically, tearing the veil off the family in a way that left nothing private. That would feel satisfying in a certain cinematic way, but it would also be unmoored from the ethics I claimed. The point was accountability, not spectacle. If there were wrongdoing that endangered other people, the small business owners, the employees and franchises, the customers who trusted a brand that might be propped up by deceit, then the ethical path was to build a case strong enough that institutions obliged themselves to act. A private spectacle might feel like justice, but it would leave structural problems intact. Yet the idea of a quiet, methodical case building did not mean I would cower. The family had deployed at casual cruelty. I would respond with rigorous clarity. I would not seek vengeance. I would gather facts, find people who could corroborate them, and then deliver them in a way that could not be dismissed as spite. That was my commitment to myself, and to Margaret's sense of rightness. Do the work, not the drama. A few days later, the Whitmore house called me for another dinner. Marcus had suggested a gathering to introduce me more formally to the family, while the weekend's social circuit allowed for the right kind of exposure. I could have declined. I thought of declining as often as I thought of staying. Declining would make a statement. I would not play their game. Staying would give me space to watch and collect. I chose to return. Preparation for that evening felt like donning armor I had chosen rather than armor imposed on me. This time I wore a dress that was not hiding my financial independence. It was chosen because the cut suited me, because I felt accurate in it. I wore flats, always flats. There was no reason for heels to change the stakes, and an old pendant from Margaret. The pendant was a private signal, a small piece of lineage, and a reminder of why I had started this. Marcus greeted me with something between relief and worry. He kissed my forehead, and I could see the roughness of his hesitation. That second dinner felt different. The Whitmores had not forgotten their first assessment. They had filed it away like a note. Patricia's eyes had a measuring quality, like a jeweler holding a stone up to the light. Vivian gave me a short lecture on the virtues of certain charities and how they reflected esteem. The conversation threaded through polite topics, until at last, somewhere between dessert and the third pour of wine, Patricia made the move that would change the ceiling of the evening. "Well, Marcus," she said, looking across at him with a smile practiced in 1,000 gatherings, "we've been thinking about what's best for everyone. A formal step could clear a lot of air. An engagement, perhaps. It helps with optics, you see." Marcus froze, a small storm crossing his face. The room turned to him like a slow-moving audience waiting for a cue.
It was not a question so much as a direction, an instruction disguised as concern. I felt the air tilt around me. An engagement might, in Patricia's mind, both placate the family and be used as a strategic device. It could be the placeholder she'd mentioned. The words landed in the room like a gauntlet. I felt my skin go cold and then suddenly flammable. There was a detail in Patricia's phrasing, a tone that suggested arrangement rather than union, that made my decision for me. She assumed Marcus's consent and my compliance. She saw us as negotiable pieces. The room expected acquiescence from both of us. Marcus looked to me, his eyes searching for what? My answer? My validation? My capitulation? There are moments when people you love ask things of you that require a different kind of answer than they intended to receive.
For Marcus, the question was easy in his head. Say yes and keep the peace. For me, the question was tactical. Margaret's words returned. Observe, then act. If Patricia wanted a public engagement used as leverage, then the platform of that engagement would also be my platform. If I agreed to the engagement in public, I would have time and space and a legitimate presence inside the family's orbit to gather what I needed, and to bring forward something the family could not explain away. I felt my mouth shape itself into the smallest, most dangerous lie. I would say yes, not because I loved the idea of being trophies and placeholders, but because sometimes the only way to expose a system is to inhabit it temporarily. Saying yes was not an acceptance of their terms. It was a tactical concession to obtain a clearer vantage point. The ring Marcus produced was a small thing, deliberately understated. A band of white metal with a stone that caught the light, but was not flawless. I noticed the clouding at its heart. Perhaps it had been chosen for subtlety, or perhaps it had been passed along. I slid it on and watched the way people exhaled as if satisfied. Marcus smiled like a man relieved of a burden. Patricia's expression softened into the look of someone who believed they had secured a future's outline. No one clapped out loud. That would have been gauche. There were, however, the small rituals. An embrace from Harold that felt perfunctory. Vivian's tight smile that did not reach her eyes. Alexandra Castellano's name made its polite rotation around the table, as if she were already an integrant in a story not quite written. The air hummed with people measuring gains, tallying outcomes. After the ring went on, I left the room for a moment, ostensibly to freshen my makeup. I stood in the hallway and let the silence wrap me. My plan had shifted from passive observation to intentional infiltration. Saying yes was a calculated move. It felt like stepping across a border where the landscape changed from observation to action. My hands were steady when I tightened the pendant at my throat. I did not tell Marcus in that hallway what I intended. There are things you decide to shoulder because they are yours to bear. I wanted his consent to be genuine, not coerced. He had the right to know the truth before any vow that might change his life in ways I did not intend. But there was also the knowledge that truth at the wrong time can get swallowed by the machinery of family maneuvering. I needed evidence that could not be shrugged away, and I needed to time its release so that it would force institutions to act because their reputations, or legal standing, were at risk. When I returned to the dining room, people murmured like a tide. The Whitmore machine had clicked another gear into place, thinking it had the initiative. It had no idea the engine that was starting inside me. I had accepted the role they offered, but I had done so with an agenda of my own. I understood the moral tightrope. Any action I took could be framed as manipulative. I had to be sure that my motivations were anchored in seeking truth and protection for others who might be harmed by the family's practices. That night, as I lay in bed, the ring cool against my finger, I thought about the line between acting for oneself and acting for the common good. There is always a shadow where those two things intersect. I told myself I would not cross from accountability into vengeance. I would gather facts. I would find allies. I would not let the story be about my humiliation or theirs. I intended it to be about patterns and consequences. The morning after, a message from Marcus waited. 3 words. Thank you. Love you. It was sincere in the way his messages usually were. Careful, gentle, a hand extended across the difficulty he always wanted to avoid. I considered answering with honesty, and chose instead a measured response. I did not want to start with a confession. I would not expose my plan without the map of evidence to back it up. The engagement had given me footing. Now I needed to make the climb. I told myself a handful of practical things over the first week wearing that ring. I would not brandish it as a trophy. I would not use it to humiliate. I would use it as leverage to gain access to documents, to conversations, to areas where patterns left evidence. I would speak with people who had been on the outside of family businesses, suppliers, franchise owners, ex-associates, without ever suggesting their complicity in a private way that endangered them. I would do it all carefully, legally, and with witnesses.
And most of all, I reminded myself of the promise I had made to Margaret: act with dignity. Exposure is not the same as celebration. If what I found was simply prejudice and social cruelty, it did not merit the same kind of public besmingling as criminal malfeasance. But if there were threads of misappropriation and willful deceit that extended beyond family squabbles, then it would be my duty to make sure those threads were woven into a public record where they could be addressed. A week into my new role, fiancé on paper, researcher in practice, I attended a small luncheon the Whitmores hosted for business contacts. It was the kind of event where accomplishments were displayed like cards on a table. I moved through it with a different focus than the rest of the room, listening rather than performing, cataloging names, noting the people who lingered on the edges of conversation. Marcus noticed how different I was and commented later that night, "You've gone quiet." I said, "Some people tell more in their quiet than in their company." He smiled, unsure whether to be proud or nervous. At the luncheon, a man I had been tipped toward by a friended colleague at work, someone who had once supplied equipment to a Whitmore-affiliated distributor, brushed past me with a furtive look.
He was older, stooped, the kind of person who has folded into the background, yet carries the map of minor betrayals on his skin. He passed me a folded napkin later in the day, a small printed name on a thumbtacked note: Richard Hartley. Not a friend yet, but a breadcrumb. I would reach for the breadcrumbs carefully. I had promised myself a path of integrity and precision. The plan moving forward was not to humiliate, but to ensure that if truth existed, it had an audience that could respond appropriately. I was no longer the woman who slipped through doors unnoticed. I was the one choosing what to reveal, when, and to whom. That night, when Marcus left for a late meeting, I sat on my small couch with the pendant warm against my palm and the ring cool on my finger. The house across the street had a light on. I thought about Margaret's garden, about how she coaxed life out of stubborn soil by tending it, not by torching it. The decision to say yes had felt like planting a seed in a plot that, for all its recklessness, I hoped would bear the fruit of accountability. I had stepped into their world not to be used, but to expose the terms under which others might be used. Outside my window, the city hummed. Inside, the kettle clicked off, and a cup of tea steamed at my elbow. The ring was a small, complex thing on my hand. It represented a new orbit I had chosen for a purpose that was both personal and principled. My throat tightened once, not with triumph, but with the gravity of the work ahead. I turned off the lights, and for the first time since that mahogany door, allowed myself to imagine what it would mean if what I suspected was true. If pieces of the Whitmore enterprise were propped up by misallocated funds, if, as Vivian had hinted, there were lines and ledgers that didn't belong, then the consequences would reach far beyond our family dinners. People could lose livelihoods. Employees who trusted a firm could lose pensions. The stakes made my small deception feel necessary and fraught. So I slept, not peacefully, but with a plan forming in the margins of my mind. Speak to Richard, start with publicly available filings, ask pointed, legal questions of suppliers, quietly collect corroboration. I would not step into vigilantism. I would seek institutional redress where it was warranted. If the Whitmores were relying on a social script and a willingness to shave edges for their benefit, their script would be read aloud and scrutinized. If they were merely cruel, I would ensure my exposure did not become a spectacle. If they were criminal, I would make sure the proper channels had the documents to act. The ring sat heavy when I washed the dishes the next morning. Marcus called at noon, his voice soft as if trying not to upset anything already fragile. "Are you still okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm fine." He sighed, a small sound of relief. "Good, I'm glad." And in that relief, I recognized again the gentle complexity of the man who loved me and feared the family he belonged to. He was not the architect of their schemes. He was their son, raised in the orbit of decisions he had not had to make. That distinction mattered. I could hold him to account and also grant him the space to choose differently. He could be my ally, or he could remain their compliance. The work ahead would show which he preferred to be. I had told myself when this began that if I played my part well, the truth would eventually demand its own stage. I had no illusion that ruin would be swift or simple. Families have long memories and deep pockets. But I also had seen how once the right people hold a folder of documents, the machinery of reputations and contracts begins to move differently. I would not be the one to push a family into irreparable ruin just because they had been cruel. I would be the one to ensure that where wrongdoing had consequences, it met the institutions designed to assess it. Even as I said to myself that I would be measured, a smaller, sharper feeling sat under everything else. I wanted them to feel the exact unease I had felt the night Patricia called me help. Not to humiliate them, that is a hollow victory, but to reestablish a balance where people could no longer assume rights to other people's fates with a smile. I wanted to be seen as someone who would not be used, and in doing so, to protect anyone else who might be next on a ledger.
Over the next few days, I began the careful work, compiling public record searches, asking loose questions of vendors without naming names, and quietly messaging a contact who might introduce me to Richard Hartley. Each inquiry was a stitch in a fabric I intended to reveal only when it could not be dismissed as personal spite. I was building a case, and the case would include statements from people who had reason to be truthful. The law and public accountability frameworks exist for a reason. They are slow and sometimes imperfect, but they are less capricious than the whims of a dinner conversation. The decision to accept the proposal had been the hinge. I felt it in the way the house of my life shifted slightly to accommodate new rhythms, social calls, invitations, the knowledge that any public move I made would echo further. It was a risk I accepted willingly, because in the ledger of my life, the balance had shifted from being measured by other people's estimations to my readiness to live honestly on my own terms, even if the path to that honesty required occupying a role I would soon discard. As I touched the pendant and felt the metal warm under my hand, I thought about what Margaret would say. She would tell me to be careful but brave, to seek truth with kindness, and to never let indignity harden into cruelty. I promised myself the same. The ring was a tool and a test. It would let me into rooms where decisions were made.
It would make people let their guard down, because a fiancé is a particular kind of witness. In truth, the plan was simpler than it felt. Stay, gather, and then present in a way that could not be ignored. A week later, there was an invitation on embossed paper, an engagement party at the Whitmore estate. Patricia's handwriting looped like a practice script. The party would be a gathering of family and select industry partners, people whose presence both validated and amplified reputation. In the footnotes, the invitation suggested that this would be a night to celebrate unity. For Patricia, celebration meant aligning narratives. For me, it would be an opportunity to watch how the public faces of business behaved when their private accounts and reputations were at stake. I folded the invitation and set it on the table. The ring on my finger caught the morning light and threw a tiny, cool beam into the room. I knew then that saying yes had convinced them. It had given me the leverage I needed. The question was what I would do with it. I stood in the middle of my small living room and made a quiet vow. I would not weaponize humiliation. I would not compromise my own integrity. But I would use every legitimate means available to me to ensure that if there was truth to what I had heard in that hallway, the suggestion that people were pieces in a private strategy for public gain, then the people and institutions that needed to know would be the ones to answer. The Whitmores believed they could manipulate the optics of a family for their ends. I was about to test whether those optics could withstand a spotlight of verifiable facts. When Marcus called again that afternoon, I decided to tell him. Not everything, but enough. I told him I wanted to speak with Richard Hartley. I didn't tell him why at first. He hesitated, then agreed to give me an introduction. His assent felt like the opening of a window in a room that had felt closed for too long. That night, as I laid out dresses and chose shoes for the engagement party to come, I understood fully the tension I had created. My pretense had been a way to see them truly, and it had put me in their orbit. Unintended consequences ripple both ways. The Whitmores had thought their plan would use me. Instead, my presence had given me vantage and agency. The family's calculations had backfired in a sense I did not yet fully know. I was not yet ready to celebrate, but the shape of what might happen both frightened and steadied me. I made my choices carefully from then on. I kept a notebook in my bag, a ledger of small observations, names, offhand remarks, a listing of which franchise managers had been asked for favors, where certain contracts had been awarded, who had complained in hushed tones about late payments. Small things might look like nothing on their own, but when they align, they form patterns that cannot be claimed as mere coincidence. The engagement party loomed like a public stage.
They intended it as a coronation. I intended it as a place to observe how their stories and their records lined up. The game they were playing assumed I would be a passive prop. They had miscalculated the kind of woman who would agree to play a role in order to change the script from within. When the day finally came, I dressed in something that said I was neither invisible nor performative. My clothes were chosen for truthfulness. My pendant lay heavy against my sternum. Marcus took my hand as we stepped into the car. His grip was familiar, and for a breath I allowed myself to imagine a life that did not involve subterfuge, just two people building small, steady things together. Then the image shifted back into focus. This was not a lifetime decision tonight. It was a moment on a long path. We arrived at the estate and the mahogany door swung open, the same threshold I had crossed months before. The room readied itself for spectacle. I moved through it with the calm of someone who knew what they needed to do. Patricia greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Vivian glided past, perfectly poised, and I caught the glint of a bracelet, a thin, expensive thing that caught the chandelier light like a minor sun. The room hummed. This party was everything they wanted it to be,
a consolidation of relationships, reputations, and assumptions. I moved through the crowd and felt a dozen small reactions like threads: admiration, curiosity, the way some people looked at the ring with unspoken evaluations. I did not seek to provoke. I sought to observe and to collect. Somewhere in the room, a man who knew contracts too well smiled at me in a way that suggested he might be useful. I made a note in my head to speak with him later. Patricia stood at the center for a moment, with the kind of composure practiced at years of social maneuvering. She offered the toasts, said the words that cemented relationships, and watched us with the expression of someone who believed she had secured an outcome. The room answered with polite applause. At the end of the evening, people had devoured the idea of us in the way they do when they crave a tidy story. It was a night about narratives. They were betting on ours. For them, my role was to fit their narrative. For me, the night was another opportunity to test and to record. I listened, I smiled, I nodded. I let the world think it had the shape it wanted. When the speeches ended, the music swelled, and the crowd dispersed into polite conversations and warm light. A man I had been hoping to speak with approached, someone who managed supply relations with franchises. He was careful at first, his voice low. "I've seen things," he said. "I don't know how to say them, but I think you should talk to Richard Hartley. He wanted to be heard a long time ago." I thanked him. I pocketed the name. The night folded into the city air, and we returned home, the car moving through streets that blurred into a gentle anonymity.
The ring on my finger felt now like the marker of a choice made, not a surrender, but a different form of resistance. In the quiet of my apartment, I sat with my notes, the pendant heavy at my throat, and the ring an uncomfortable, constant reminder of the tightrope I was walking. I had accepted the role they offered. The ring sat on my finger like a compass I hadn't wanted, but which pointed me toward work I now knew I could not avoid. The pendant warmed against my sternum, a small, steady reminder of why I'd stepped across that threshold in flats and a cheap dress. I leaned into the plan with the same kind of methodical stubbornness I used when debugging a program. Identify the points of failure, trace the calls, and gather reproducible evidence. If you're into true-life relationship dramas, like and comment where you're watching from. I'll wait while you do that. The first call I made was the literal humankind, Richard Hartley. I'd learned his name from a man who had handled shipments for one of the Whitmore-affiliated distributors. Now I was finally dialing the number Marcus had muttered months earlier, with the kind of reluctance people show when mentioning an old bruise. Richard answered on the second ring, voice rough with the kind of distrust that time and bad business cultivate. He did not want my pity. He wanted recognition that what had happened to him was not some isolated misfortune. Within an hour of meeting him in a small cafe whose tablecloth had seen better days, he laid out a story that fit the pattern I'd begun to suspect. Contracts that should have gone public, payments redirected to entities that neither supplied goods nor held inventory, delays in royalties that left small operators scrambling while a brand's facade remained polished. He showed me his own paperwork, emails, invoices, an internal memo that mentioned a payment to an entity with a name that matched a shell company I'd already seen in a public filing. Nothing clandestine, nothing hacked, just records he had saved and never forgotten. Richard's bitterness came with a clarity I respected. He'd lost money, sure, but more than that, he'd lost the trust that allows one to do business without looking over their shoulder. He wanted restitution. He also wanted someone to tell the story the way it needed to be told, with documents, witnesses, and context. He offered me what he could: copies of correspondence, the name of his former bookkeeper who had balked and later left, and a willingness to stand where it mattered. I listened. I added what he gave me to the small ledger I'd been keeping in the margins of my life: names, dates, the scent of things that would not easily be explained away. From there, the work was granular, the kind of slow excavation that rewards patience. I accessed public corporate filings, articles of incorporation, lists of registered agents.
I called suppliers and left neutral-sounding voicemails asking about typical payment windows. I asked franchise owners about reimbursement timelines, not as an enemy, but as someone curious about the differences between policy and practice. People who were tired of being owed tended to speak in ways that left little room for plausible deniability. A coffee shop owner who had sold uniforms to a Whitmore-affiliated location told me offhand that the checks had started arriving months late, and then arrived in increments tied to strange references. Another former manager hinted that expense reimbursements had once been approved and then quietly rescinded. Each small voice, an invoice here, a ledger entry there, was a tile in a larger mosaic. I also relied on things that were public and therefore safe:
photos taken at charity functions, event programs, meeting minutes that had been filed as part of a nonprofit's annual disclosures. There were public snapshots of Marcus and Alexandra at a gala months before, hand in hand on a balcony, smiles trained for cameras, images that contradicted the family's narrative of Alexandra as a distant potential ally and not someone with whom Marcus had a history. None of these things required subterfuge. They were already in the light. My work was to arrange them so the pattern could be read. Marcus's role in all of this was, in its own way, the hardest to catalog. He oscillated between shame and avoidance. Sometimes he would text in the evening, small care notes that felt like kindness. Sometimes he would be absent for hours, pulled into family meetings I was not invited to. He tried to believe that distance was protection. Distance from me, distance from the decisions made in rooms he accepted without questioning. I did not want to corner him into a confession. I needed his consent to live honestly together, and that included choosing sides. After a week of dialogue laced with his apologies and my quiet refusals to be comforted by gestures, he agreed to let me contact Richard. He said in a voice that was almost a plea that he wanted whatever truth emerged to be clear and fair. That day I believed him more for his willingness to make the call than for the words themselves. Richard introduced me to a few people who had once been close to the Whitmore operation, a former regional manager who had never seen the promised payouts, a bookkeeper who had resigned when told to adjust entries, and a supplier who had been paid with checks that cleared and then seemed to vanish in subsequent audits. The bookkeeper, when she agreed to meet with us, showed me photocopies of vouchers, forms that documented travel and vendor payments that went to an entity named in filings, but tied to Vivian by way of an address that, when cross-checked with property records, came back to a trust set up under a name she frequently used to register small LLCs. The numbers were not screaming yet. Numbers rarely do. They murmured.
But once aligned with witness statements and a pattern of accruals and write-offs, murmurs became sane. Vivian's spending, I slowly understood, was not the vanity of a person who enjoyed a flashy bracelet. It was a pattern of siphoning, reimbursements for non-existent events, inflated vendor contracts, and travel expenses that had no corroborating receipts when requested. These things were legal in the sense that one could make an invoice look like a legitimate expense. They were illegal if they were knowingly authorized and then disguised to hide the diversion of funds. That distinction matters in law and in ethics. My job was not to convict in a court of public opinion. It was to collect enough lawful, corroborated material to present to the people who could compel an audit: manufacturers, franchisors, regulators. We moved deliberately. We created folders. Richard, who had been burned by the family's appetites, was meticulous in his resentment. He would not let passion cloud the work. He wanted the case to be airtight because he had learned that anger without documentation can be dismissed as sour grapes. He forwarded me emails that showed a string of transfers to accounts registered to shell companies. He gave me names of vendors who had been paid twice for the same shipments. I took photographs of what he handed me, uploaded them into a secure drive, and backed them up. Each file earned a line in my ledger. There were moments when gathering evidence felt painfully ordinary, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of PDFs, calling a franchise owner who was trembling with the relief of finally sharing what he had been instructed to keep secret, or driving to a small town to meet a supplier who wanted his name off the record, but was willing to sign a statement once he saw the pattern. Those encounters taught me more about the human cost of a polished facade than any dramatic revelation. I listened to stories of late payrolls, of store managers covering costs with their own credit, of people who had taken loans to keep doors open while their invoices were promised and then delayed. These were not faceless numbers. They were livelihoods. That knowledge grounded my work in something larger than family drama. As the dossier grew, so did the risk that someone would notice. Vivian's social feed had an air of untroubled abundance: luncheons, fundraisers, bracelets that twinkled like small fortunes. Patricia maintained a calm that could make scandal appear theatrical. The Whitmore name had currency, and currency buys time. We needed to ensure the people who could alter that time, manufacturers, large suppliers, and industry partners, had access to what we had compiled, and could act quickly if the evidence warranted it. We made a cautious outreach to a manufacturer with known ties to the Whitmore franchises. I phrased my inquiries as someone concerned about operational irregularities and provided the sort of high-level documentation that made a compliance officer sit up: a timeline of delayed royalty payments, corroborating vendor statements, and copies of contracts that suggested funds were being routed in ways that diverted company resources. They did not become hysterical. They became quietly attentive. Regulators and corporate compliance teams do not like uncertainty. They like a file they can validate. Our goal was to get the file into the right hands. Meanwhile, the Whitmore household continued its rituals. Marcus was increasingly distant, and sometimes I caught him watching me with a kind of pleading that felt like guilt softened into hope. He would try to start sentences: apologies, half-confessions, offers to mediate,
and then stop when the cost of speaking aloud became suddenly visible. I did not want to extract his pain. I wanted him to choose truth on his own. Still, our private conversations acquired an undercurrent of tension. He wanted to protect the family's sense of honor. I wanted to protect the truth. There was an evening in late autumn when Marcus called from the study, voice barely a whisper. "They want you to cut it back, the public part," he said. "They're worried about optics." I closed my laptop and listened to the small steam whistle of the kettle as if it were a judge. "Optics are the problem," I said, "not the thing." The night of the big engagement reception, the one Patricia imagined as a coronation and I imagined as a public stage, arrived with a frost that made the estate's hedges look like sugar. I chose a dress that had pockets in places that felt pragmatic, a quiet nod to the woman who wanted to be prepared rather than admired. The pendant lay warm at my throat, and the ring was a small weight on my finger. Marcus walked by my side to the car. His grip was steady, his face taut. "You sure about this?" he asked, the question not about the party, but about the logic that had led us here, the ledger of consequences and the slow construction of accountability. "I'm sure about what I'm doing," I answered. "I'm not sure about who will accept what I show them, but I am sure I have to try." He lowered his head. "I don't want to lose you," he said, "even if this hurts it." "It won't be about hurting them," I interrupted gently. "It will be about showing what's already there. Hurt is collateral, Marcus. Accountability is the goal." We arrived to the same mahogany door, a threshold that had once been an entrance into a theater of judgment and was now a stage I would use. Guests flew in, laughing, hands full of compliments. Patricia floated through the room in a dress that had been made to intimidate quietly. Vivian was all animation. The air smelled of champagne and carefully chosen flowers.
I listened to the small rhythms of people recounting stories they preferred, the ones that neatly arranged themselves into a narrative of continuity and success. I had not told the Whitmores what I intended to do. I did not intend to reveal the dossier in a way that shocked and burned without reason. My aim was a moment of exposure that could not be hand-waved away. My collaborator for the reveal was, improbably, a corporate compliance representative who had taken an interest in our inquiries. They had asked to see the evidence privately before the night ended, just enough to know whether the claims had legs. We agreed with a simple arrangement. I would speak at a natural crescendo in the evening, and representatives with the authority to act would be in the room, informed and ready to respond to what I presented. There was a dizzying microscopic logic to the plan. The family strategy relied on optics. A public engagement would soothe anxious partners, a whisper of scandal could be managed, an apology manufactured. My counter-strategy relied on institutions. When the right proprietary documents are presented to compliance officers and regulatory counsel, the machinery of oversight starts to move in ways a family dinner cannot spin back. As the main course folded into dessert, Patricia arranged for a small speech. She had practiced the lines that would cement the narrative of unity and future alliances. Her voice cut through the room with a calm authority. The air expected applause. The air got something else. I rose because a good speech has a pause where someone might stand and say what needs to be said. Rising felt like stepping into sunlight. My voice held where theirs had been murmur. I began simply, thankful for hospitality, grateful for the night, but the rhythm of my words shifted. I told a brief, measured story about how a person's worth is often measured when no one famous watches. I said enough that people turned to see which story I would choose. Then I moved to the facts. A photo of Marcus with Alexandra at a public gala months earlier, presented not as an attack but as context for decisions the family had claimed were purely business. Vendor statements and invoices that suggested payments to entities of dubious purpose, sworn statements from a supplier about delayed checks that made running a business impossible. I watched faces. Patricia's smile did not falter immediately, but her grip on the microphone tightened. Vivian's laugh evaporated. Marcus looked helpless in his chair, the color leaving his face. People murmured, first curious, then alarmed. I handed the floor to Richard. He had asked me to let him speak because his voice was one that had been silenced by contracts and fear. It was also someone who had a stack of papers with his name on them that could not be ignored. He stepped forward with a folder and a steadiness that came from spending years convincing oneself that wrongs were not inevitable.
Richard did not shout. His voice was blunt and factual. He described diverted payments, duplicate invoices, and other anomalies. He spoke of a franchise system that had been propped up while small operators were left to crumble. He presented copies of emails and bank statements he had in his possession, things he had collected legally as part of his failed attempt to reconcile his accounts. No one could suggest he had hacked or forged anything. It was all material he had been given or had compiled in the course of trying to get his business back on solid ground. There was, in the room, a taut silence. when the compliance officer, who'd been sitting quietly with a name badge that suggested authority, leaned forward and said, "We will need to review these documents and suspend relations pending inquiry." The words landed like a gavel. People moved from shock into management. Phones were produced. A murmur that had been private until now became a swell. Representatives at the table, who had never had cause to question the Whitmore name, were suddenly checking their contracts, making notes, calling their legal teams. Patricia's face shifted from composed to brittle in the space of a single breath. "This is preposterous," she said at first, voice strung with the practiced tone of denial. "These are allegations." She looked for allies in the faces around her. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others checked their own satchels as if noting the presence of a risk. Vivian did not yell. She tried to scoff, and then folded when Richard produced documents that matched the ledger I'd been keeping. There was no theatrical confession from her, only a small, human panic that made the carefully arranged jewels and laughter suddenly seem like a costume. Someone at the table called for the attention of a franchisor representative. Once that door opened, the momentum shifted. Marcus stood at some point, hands trembling. "It's complicated," he began, and then he looked at me with a question in his eyes that was both apology and plea. "Ella, You can speak to anyone you like," I said, quiet but hard. "You can tell them everything. You can tell them you knew and you tried to stop it. You can tell them you were told different things, but I have to follow the facts." He took a step forward and then stopped, the man torn by family loyalty, self-preservation, and something like remorse. "We never meant to," he started, but someone near the fringe raised a hand, and the phrase dissolved into a litany of questions that needed a corporate answer, not a household one. When the conversation grew loud, I did a small, public thing. I removed the ring. It was not dramatic in the way a movie might stage it. It was practical. I slid it off my finger and set it on the edge of a small bowl on a drinks table. The movement did more than make a point. It punctured, gently, the tableau of endorsement Patricia had tried to create. There was a collective intake of breath.
Marcus's face crumpled. "Ella," he said, reaching, and his fingers hovered over the ring as if reconsidering geography and meaning. I did not hand it back. I let the object rest where it was, an item separated from intention. Richard's folder had done its work. The compliance officer made a quiet call, asked for a formal submission, and told the room they would act to protect their interests pending investigation. That was not a conviction. It was the beginning of a process that could, if the facts held, lead to consequences. The word that so many family gatherings dread echoed in the room: audit. In the hours that followed, there was a flurry of activity that made the evening feel like a weather event. Phones lit up. Someone from the franchisor's legal team requested an immediate set of documents. A reporter who had been at the party as a social flaneur texted an editor with a one-line. Things escalated. I asked Richard to insist that our presentation remain focused on verifiable documents and not on spectacle. He obliged. We had not come to humiliate. We had come to ensure accountability. The immediate fallout was not apocalyptic. There were not sirens or arrests at the door. There were, however, very real ripples. A manufacturer's rep sent a terse email about temporary suspension of new contracts pending review. A couple of suppliers quietly froze payments pending clarification. A handful of small franchisees who had been struggling contacted compliance officers who were now aware that their complaints were not isolated incidents. The Whitmore name had lost some of its sheen in the room where reputation is currency and currency is defensive. In the private unraveling that followed, I learned the difference between being complicit and being willfully blind. Marcus's role was messy. He was not the brains of any scheme, but he had, over time, allowed a family inertia to carry him. He had not shaped the ledger, but he had been content to read from it. That complacency had crossed him, and it had caused people far beyond our family dinners. After the party, there were calls I should not have expected to get. Some were angry. Patricia's voice clipped and thin over the line, saying words that tried to weaponize our shared past. Others were frightened. Vivian sent a message that read simply, "You'll regret this." Threats are the language of those who have relied on the assumption that power confers immunity. They are also predictable. Marcus reached out differently. He called to say, "I don't know where to go from here." He wanted advice, absolution, something that resembled the life we had imagined. I told him, in a voice that was closer to myself than to a woman in crisis, that the thing I wanted from him was accountability, not for a show, but for a life he could stand behind. I could not be part of a narrative where my existence was negotiable. He asked if reconciliation might still be possible.
I told him that might be true someday, but only if he could choose truth repeatedly, even when it cost him. The professional responses began to roll in. Request for documentation, inquiries from lawyers, a note that one of the franchisors had opened a formal investigation. We did not assume victory. We prepared for long meetings, for lawyers, for mediations. The law moves with a calculus that is both patient and indifferent. It does not mete out moral satisfaction in a dinner speech. It does, however, provide structures by which claims can be tested. In the weeks after, headlines, carefully written and not breathless, reported that the Whitmore family was under scrutiny by their own industry partners.
I insisted that my name remain private in the coverage. If institutions were to act, it should be because the documents required action, not because I had sought publicity. Richard agreed to speak on the record about his own grievances. I agreed to let those in charge of the process do their work. There were nights when I laid awake thinking about the cost, about the people who would suffer because a brand had been mismanaged, about small business owners who had trusted accounts that were shaky. I regretted collateral damage in the way you regret a necessary storm. Regret did not mean regret for holding them accountable. It meant sorrow that systems allowed harm to be distributed among people who had not chosen to be complicit. As the formal inquiries grew, so did the personal consequences for the Whitmores. Vivian was asked to step down from the operational role she held while an internal review took place. Patricia's social calendar thinned in ways that felt practical and punitive at once. Contracts were paused, conversations began about restitution. None of it was neat, none of it offered the satisfaction of revenge. It offered instead the slow work of repair or consequences, an institutional response that could lead to restitution or legal reckoning. Marcus reached out to me in the bleak quiet that follows the initial shock. "I thought family is what you defend," he said once. "I thought loyalty meant protecting the people you love." "Loyalty isn't blind," I answered. "It is choosing truth in front of the people who mean the most to you. It's accepting the embarrassment of being wrong if it means you fix what you can." He did not have words at first. Then in a message I opened 3 days after the party, he wrote, "I'm sorry, I wanted to be braver sooner." I read it and then closed the phone. There was a part of me that wanted to run into his arms, and another part that remembered that love tests itself against action. Eventually, he came to a meeting where he agreed to cooperate with inquiries in a limited fashion, to give statements, to open channels. It was not the sweeping, cinematic conversion of someone who wakes up overnight as an entirely new person. It was the quiet, hard work of someone who finally allowed their eyes to open.
My life did not pivot on a single reveal. The legal and corporate machinery moved in the sober, deliberate ways I had expected. There were subpoenas, there were meetings with compliance officers, and there were angry conversations that left families rearranged. Richard filed a claim and hired counsel. A few small vendors received partial restitution. Some franchisees were offered mediation. I kept my name out of the headlines because my purpose had never been celebrity. It had been accountability. In the aftermath, the personal cost to me was a series of small losses and many recoveries. A handful of acquaintances who had once slid into my life for the light of a family name fell away. Some of my own friends asked difficult questions about whether I had crossed a line. The line I held to was simple: expose truth, not people. Make institutions act where institutions had reason to act. If a family meal produced a plan to use people, it deserved to be exposed to sunlight. There were moments of quiet triumph, not loud. A small franchise owner whose store had teetered for months on the edge of closing because of delayed reimbursements sent me a private note of thanks once the compliance team initiated an audit. It was a paragraph of relief that read like payback, far more sustained than any social media victory. Those notes, soft, grateful, private, were the real outcome I had hoped for. I also learned that victory rarely resembles the image you hold while planning. It is messy. It requires patience. It requires forgiveness in me where possible and appropriate, and firm boundaries where necessary. Marcus and I did not break up in a single scene. We talked about membership in each other's lives, about whether a relationship built under the weight of family affectation could transform into something founded on shared truth. In the end, I realized the shape of what I wanted was not rescue. It was partnership. If he could not choose that, then the marriage, if marriage was even an eventuality, would be hollow. The messages came less frequently after the investigations began in earnest. Vivian sent one longer text that read like a lyre of wounded entitlement. Patricia called a few times, each conversation a study in brittle civility. Harold, who attended to remain at the edges, reached out in a short, private message that read simply, "I'm sorry." I folded that apology up and kept it with the other small, ambiguous artifacts of a life rearranged. When the dust settled into a new normal, the Whitmore enterprise had been assigned audits. A few contracts had been renegotiated under tighter scrutiny, and some of the more arrogant flourishes of their social calendar took a hiatus. Their reputation, which had been an asset they often wore like armor, had become for a time a liability. For me, the aftermath felt like stepping into a day that had been cleared of fog.
I returned to my apartment and my modest rituals, the chipped mug, the thrifted curtains, the morning tea. The pendant warmed under my fingers in the same steady way it had months before. I put the ring in a small box and handed it to Marcus when we sat across from each other on my tiny couch. No public stage, no audience, just two people in the quiet that awkwardly follows major life edits. "I can't wear this anymore," I said. It meant something to me when I put it on, but the thing it represented no longer exists in the way I thought it might. Marcus nodded.
He looked older. He looked perhaps like someone who had seen his own shadow and was trying to step out of it. "I don't expect anything from you," I told him, "except for yourself, to choose truth when it's hard." We parted in a way that was not cinematic or saintly. We parted like two people who had been honest and who now had to live with the consequences of that honesty. He left that afternoon with a small suitcase and a promise to get help, counseling perhaps, and the messy work of sorting loyalties. I closed the door and felt a soft, steady grief for what might have been, but also an unclenching that comes with no longer having to perform. A few weeks later, as the formal processes continued at their deliberate pace, I sat at my kitchen table with my grandmother's pendant between my fingers and a modest stack of unpaid invoices that someone had sent me as a thank you for referring them to a new supplier. I felt the ordinary, quiet life reassert itself in the small, stubborn ways that matter. The kettle hissed. The city hummed. I had not sought to be a heroine. I had sought to be honest. I deleted one of Marcus's messages that asked whether I might ever forgive him. It was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of closure. Deleting the thread was like closing a chapter with a pencil mark rather than with a shout. I did not need the digital breadcrumb trail to remember. The memory would be honest enough, and that was enough. On a late Sunday afternoon, I walked Margaret's old garden path. The flowers she used to fuss over had a stubbornness that belonged to people who'd seen hard winters and chose to plant anyway. I thought of her voice, calm, practical, insisting that dignity was not a costume, but a practice. I felt proud, and also weary. Pride is an odd companion to this kind of work. It's not the delicious, loud thing paraded on social media. It's the quiet certainty that you did what you believed was right, even when it was costly. If anything surprised me about the whole ordeal, it was how small the final personal triumph felt, and how large its ripple effects could be. A name on a ledger, a supplier's courage to speak, an ally like Richard who chose to use his voice, all of it mattered in ways that were both immediate and ongoing. I had chosen not to name myself in the press, because institutions needed to act without the distraction of a single crusader.
That was a choice that felt right and hard, and in the end, true to the reason I'd first walked through that mahogany door. There are nights when I still think about Patricia's whisper, "You could be the help." The words land differently now. They no longer bruise me the way they did. Instead, they stand as a marker of what a person can do when they decide they will not be used as a placeholder in someone else's ledger. I do not tell this story to boast. I tell it because the arrangement of many small, careful acts, documenting, listening to people who have been sidelined, deciding to act with integrity, produces results that can outlast the momentary satisfaction of humiliation. The Whitmores were not destroyed in an instant. They were made accountable in a way that had been unlikely at the start of the night I walked through their door. That accountability required patience, allies, and a refusal to let indignity calcify into cruelty. I returned to work after the inquiries settled into long procedures. My days are full of code and design and the small satisfactions of problem solving in a profession that rewards clarity. At the end of those days, I make tea. I polish Margaret's pendant occasionally and wear it when I need its quiet company. Sometimes I meet friends for dinner and talk about the banal things, recipes, city politics, the weather. Sometimes I talk about courage and about the slow work of undoing what power has built when it is misused. If you're watching this and you've ever been measured by someone else's ledger, know that you have options that are not spectacle. You can gather facts, you can listen to people who've been wronged, you can bring concerns to institutions that are obligated to respond. You can choose to be patient and principled. You can also choose to leave. All of those are reasonable choices, depending on your life and your risk. In the end, the thing I learned that Margaret had always known in her knobby-fingered way is simple. Character shows when no one glamorous is watching. But character also grows when someone chooses, with quiet resolve, to do the work of accountability. I had pretended to be poor and naive when I met Marcus's family. That pretense gave them license in the moment to reveal who they were. It also gave me the vantage to do something about it. In a strange way, their plan to use me as a placeholder backfired. They thought they were playing chess, and they forgot there are players who choose different rules. My life is quieter now. The ring is gone, the pendant stays. I wake each morning and try to be steady and fair, which is less heroic than it sounds. If I have any final piece of advice, it is this. Dignity is both practice and boundary. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just the consistent refusal to let others write your worth on somebody else's ledger. If you want more real-life stories with unexpected endings and the kind of outcomes that come from patience and clarity, subscribe. Thank you for listening.